It was just another ordinary morning in the forest reserve, or at least it seemed to be. Ethan, a biologist who dedicated his life to the preservation of local wildlife, was accustomed to the sound of trees dancing in the wind and the songs of birds that graced the area daily. For him, nature was a refuge but also an open wound, a constant reminder of past mistakes he couldn't forget. Everything changed when an unexpected sound echoed among the trees. It was a deep, guttural noise filled with anguish. Ethan paused in the middle of his routine, furrowing his brow. It wasn't the typical sound of the animals he knew. It was something different, something that seemed to be pleading for help. He tried to ignore it. He had heard similar calls before and knew that the forest could be cruel on its own. But that sound wouldn't stop. After a few minutes, he couldn't resist any longer. He grabbed his first aid kit and began walking toward the sound. With each step, the air felt heavier, as if the forest were trying to tell a story he still couldn't comprehend. He knew he was getting closer when the sound became clearer. Now it sounded more like a moan or a lament. Then Ethan saw it. Among the dense vegetation, an adult gorilla emerged, limping. Its fur, black as coal, was caked with dirt and blood. It was immense, but it didn't convey any threat. On the contrary, the look the gorilla gave Ethan carried something that human words could never fully describe. Pain, perhaps, or desperation. But above all, a silent plea. Ethan froze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, and there were only the two of them, the man and the animal, both marked by invisible scars. He knew he should back away, keep his distance. It was the most basic rule of coexisting with wildlife, but at the same time, something in his heart screamed that if he turned his back now, he would never forgive himself. The gorilla made a slow movement with its hand, dragging it across the ground, as if trying to balance itself. The wound on its leg was deep, and Ethan felt a knot in his stomach at the thought of what could have caused it. He took a deep breath, trying to control the adrenaline starting to surge through his veins. It wasn't just the animal's pain that hit him, it was the urgency in its eyes. Ethan knew what he had to do, even if it meant confronting the past he was trying to bury. In that moment, a silent connection was formed. Ethan took a hesitant step forward while the gorilla remained still. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, though he didn't expect a response. And in doing so, he felt as if he were answering a greater call, something that came from the very soul of the forest. Ethan stood before the wounded gorilla, but it felt as if he were standing at the edge of an abyss. He looked at the wound on the animal's leg, the dried blood contrasting with the damp earth around it. As much as everything inside him screamed to act, something held him back. It wasn't the fear of danger. He had faced situations like this before. It was the fear of failing again. There was a memory that Ethan couldn't shake off. Years ago, he had tried to help another injured animal, a young fawn, but his human intervention had ended up attracting predators. He carried that guilt like an invisible scar, and it seemed to scream even louder now. "What if I hurt it more than I help?" he thought, as the gorilla continued to stare at him. But there was something different about that moment. It wasn't just the animal's physical pain that drew Ethan's attention. It was the silence, and how the gorilla wasn't fighting against his presence. He knew that instinctively, a wild animal would never make itself vulnerable to a human unless it was desperate. The gorilla was trusting him, even without knowing who he was. Ethan took a deep breath. He looked at the backpack he carried, filled with basic first aid supplies. Nothing there would be enough to treat such a deep wound, but maybe it would be enough to ease the pain and buy some time. Doubt still gnawed at him. Should I call for backup? Take the gorilla to the rehabilitation center? Or would it be better to leave it in the forest to avoid unnecessary stress? Time seemed to be running against him. Ethan knew he couldn't hesitate much longer. The longer he stood there, the greater the risk grew. The risk that the gorilla would get worse or that something worse would happen to it. Then a distant memory surfaced. The words of his mentor, a veterinarian who guided him in his early years of fieldwork. "You won't always have all the answers, Ethan. Sometimes you just need to listen to your instinct." And that's exactly what he did. He slowly crouched down, keeping his eyes on the gorilla. "I'm going to help you, buddy," he whispered, as if his words could somehow comfort the animal. With trembling hands, he began rummaging through his backpack. Even so, doubt still weighed heavily on his shoulders. Could he do this without causing more pain? Was he making the right decision? But as he prepared the materials, something in the gorilla's gaze seemed to shift. It wasn't just pain. It was trust. And at that moment, Ethan realized something that would change everything. This encounter wasn't just about saving the gorilla. It was about saving himself. Still, he knew the path ahead would be long and full of uncertainties. And the first step began right there. Ethan slowly knelt down as if stepping onto sacred ground. He knew that any sudden movement could startle the gorilla or provoke a defensive reaction. What surprised him, however, was the animal's calmness. Despite the evident pain, it remained still, breathing heavily, but watching Ethan's every move with an almost human-like attention. When he finally managed to look closely, Ethan swallowed hard. The wound was deep, an irregular cut that extended along the upper part of the gorilla's leg. The edges were inflamed, with clear signs of infection. But what troubled him even more was what had caused it. Marks from a metal wire, like a hunter's trap. The knot in Ethan's stomach tightened. The idea that something so cruel was still happening in this region filled him with anger and sadness. He tried to remain calm as he took out an antiseptic solution and some makeshift bandages. But then, something hit him like a punch. What if he was wrong? What if the gorilla interpreted his touch as a threat? No matter how calm it seemed, it was impossible to predict the behavior of a wild animal, especially in a state of pain. Fear crept into his mind, trying to paralyze him, but he fought against it. When he applied the antiseptic for the first time, the gorilla flinched slightly, letting out a low, hoarse sound, a mix of pain and warning. Ethan's heart raced. He kept his hands raised in an attempt to show that he meant no harm. "I know it hurts," he murmured almost unconsciously. "Just a little longer, I promise." His voice was soft, almost a plea, but it seemed enough to calm the animal, which didn't try to pull away any further. As he worked, Ethan noticed something curious. The gorilla kept its gaze fixed on him, as if trying to understand his intentions. It was an intense look, almost uncomfortable, but filled with a strange acceptance. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as if this being, so imposing yet so vulnerable, trusted him more than he trusted himself. With the wound finally cleaned and covered, Ethan took a step back, relieved to have completed that stage without incident. But at the same time, a new concern overtook his mind. That bandage was only a temporary solution. The infection already seemed advanced, and he knew the gorilla would need more intensive care to survive. The question was, how could he transport it without causing even more stress? As he tried to think of a solution, Ethan realized that something larger was at stake. This gorilla was not just another injured animal, it was a survivor, someone who, in some way, knew it needed the help of a human. And that was as impressive as it was frightening. Ethan didn't know how, but he felt that this encounter was far from a coincidence. It was the beginning of something much greater. Ethan spent the night wide awake. Every sound in the forest seemed louder than usual, but what troubled him was not the noises around him. It was the persistent feeling that something was wrong. He couldn't take his eyes off the gorilla, which, even weakened, remained alert. From time to time, the animal would glance into the darkness of the forest with an almost hypnotic intensity, as if waiting for something or someone. His unease grew when Ethan noticed that the gorilla was making a low sound, a type of rhythmic murmur. He had heard similar sounds before, but always in specific contexts. It was a call, not for him, but for others of its kind. Ethan's heart tightened. This meant the gorilla wasn't alone. Perhaps it had left a group behind, or worse, maybe they were in danger. Determined to understand better what was happening, Ethan followed the instincts that had led him countless times to uncover hidden truths in nature. He grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and began to follow the tracks he had noticed near the area where he found the gorilla. The broken branches and marks on the ground indicated that something, or someone, had passed through there recently. He knew it could be dangerous, but he couldn't ignore the sense of urgency. As he moved along the trail, the forest seemed to close in around him, each shadow projecting unsettling shapes. Then he found something that made him stop immediately. A devastated area with clear signs of human interference. Abandoned nets, tire marks, and on the ground, dark stains that appeared to be blood. Ethan felt a chill. This could only mean one thing: poachers. While examining the site, he found an even more disturbing clue: a small metallic object stuck to the trunk of a tree. It was a transmitter, the kind used to track captured animals. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. This explained the gorilla's wound, but it also suggested something even more terrible. There were other gorillas in the sights of these poachers, and they were likely already in danger. With his heart racing, Ethan quickly returned to where the injured gorilla was. He knew the connection between them was fragile, but he needed answers. "You came to me for a reason, didn't you?" he murmured, as if the animal could understand his words. The gorilla's gaze once again seemed to confirm what Ethan already feared. This was not just a plea for help. It was a warning. At that moment, Ethan realized that his mission had completely changed. It was no longer just about saving the injured gorilla. He needed to find out what had happened to the others, and more importantly, prevent them from becoming victims. The forest was full of secrets, but the truth was beginning to reveal itself, and Ethan knew he couldn't turn back now. Ethan couldn't think of anything else. What had the poachers done to the family of that gorilla? Was it alone? Or had the others also been captured? The metallic transmitter found on the trunk wouldn't leave his mind. It was like a grim clue, a silent warning that there was more at stake than he could imagine. But he knew he needed to act quickly. Every second that passed was precious. As Ethan analyzed what to do next, the injured gorilla began to move. Slow and visibly exhausted, it tried to rise, despite its injured leg. Ethan felt a rush of alarm. "Easy, buddy, you can't push yourself like that just yet," he said softly, trying to soothe it. But the gorilla seemed determined. It looked at Ethan and then at the dense forest, as if trying to guide him, even in its weakened state. Reluctantly, Ethan decided to follow the gorilla, which moved with difficulty, but with a clear direction. The journey felt tense. Each step made Ethan's heart race. He knew that if the poachers were still nearby, things could end badly. Not just for him, but for the gorilla as well. Yet something in the animal's determined gaze compelled him to continue. It was as if the gorilla was saying, "They need you." After a few minutes of walking, they arrived at a clearing. What Ethan saw there made his stomach turn. On the ground were signs of a hastily dismantled camp, human footprints, leftover food, and even scattered ropes. But what caught his attention the most were the drag marks in the soil, as if something heavy had been taken away. He looked at the gorilla, which was now emitting a low sound, almost a lament. Ethan understood. This was the last location of its family before they were taken. While examining the area, Ethan found something that made his blood run cold. An abandoned cage, large enough to hold several gorillas. The marks on the iron bars showed that they had tried to escape, unsuccessfully. Ethan knelt before the cage, touching the marks, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. He knew the poachers were transporting the gorillas out of the reserve, but where to? And how much time did he have to stop it? Ethan turned his attention back to the injured gorilla. Even exhausted, it continued to make the same low sounds as if calling for its family. The sound was so filled with pain and longing that Ethan had to look away for a moment. He knew he needed to do something, but how could he fight against experienced poachers? He was alone, without immediate support, and the gorillas were becoming more distant by the minute. But in that moment of doubt, something shifted within Ethan. He realized he couldn't just think about the risks. The gorilla trusted him, and now the life of an entire family rested in his hands. He clenched his fists, stood up, and took a deep breath. "I won't let it end like this," he murmured to himself. Ethan knew he needed to be quick, strategic, and above all, courageous. The fight for those gorillas was just beginning. Ethan recognized that he couldn't face this alone. He headed back to the small rehabilitation center where he kept supplies, and while the gorilla rested, he grabbed the radio he used for emergencies. He wasn't the type of person to ask for help, but now he had no choice. He reached out to two trusted friends, Lara, an experienced forest ranger, and Miguel, an environmental photographer familiar with the area and the dangers posed by illegal hunters. Both responded to his call without hesitation. When Lara and Miguel arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan explained what he had found: the transmitter, the struggle marks on the cage, the signs of transport. Lara looked visibly disturbed. "This is more organized than it seems," she said. "If they're using transmitters, it's because they plan to sell these gorillas on the black market. We need to act fast." Ethan agreed, but the looming question was, where would the poachers be now? As they planned the rescue, Ethan noticed something surprising. The injured gorilla, even in its weakened state, seemed to want to participate. It rose, emitted sounds, and even attempted to walk. Lara looked at it with admiration. "I've never seen anything like this before. It knows we're trying to help." Ethan knew this was true, but he also worried for the animal. Still, that behavior seemed to indicate one thing: the gorilla might lead the group to the right place. The journey to the poacher's location was intense. The group followed the clues left by the marks on the ground, and to their surprise, the gorilla continued to move ahead despite its visible pain. It was as if it knew its family depended on this. Miguel, who had always been skeptical about communication between humans and animals, was astonished. "It's guiding us," he murmured, almost in disbelief. When they finally reached their destination, the group hid among the trees. In an open valley, Ethan saw what he feared. Two trucks with cages in the back, several of them containing restless, frightened gorillas. Armed poachers circulated the area, laughing and chatting, as if it were just another day at work. The sight filled Ethan with fury. It was inhumane, cruel. He knew he couldn't fail. Carefully, Lara outlined a plan. Miguel would create a distraction while she and Ethan attempted to open the cages. But what no one expected was for the injured gorilla to step forward. It let out a loud, hoarse cry that echoed through the forest, catching the attention of the poachers. Before they could react, it charged forward, limping, displaying all its strength and courage. Ethan shouted for it to stop, but it was too late. The gorilla was willing to do anything to save its family. Chaos erupted in the camp. Amidst the screams, the rush, and the fierce determination of the gorilla, Ethan and Lara managed to open the cages while Miguel distracted the poachers with a false noise created by his equipment. The captured gorillas bolted into the forest, free once again. However, when Ethan looked back, he saw the injured gorilla collapsed, exhausted, on the ground. It had given everything it had. Ethan rushed to its side, kneeling beside it and whispering, "You did it! They're free! You made it happen." The silence that followed the chaos felt as deep as the forest around them. Ethan stayed by the injured gorilla, which was breathing heavily, exhausted but alive. The other gorillas had already vanished into the darkness of the trees, freed thanks to the sacrifice and determination of the one now lying on the ground. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. He had never witnessed such courage, and the gorilla hadn't just fought for its family, but had also shown Ethan the meaning of altruism in its purest form. Lara and Miguel approached, still catching their breath. Lara placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, with a tone of respect in her voice, "I've never seen anything like this. It gave us a chance we never would have had alone." Miguel, who usually maintained a more detached demeanor, looked visibly moved. This isn't just instinct. It knew what it was doing. That was extraordinary. Ethan knew the gorilla needed immediate care. With as much caution as possible, he, Lara, and Miguel improvised a stretcher to transport it back to the rehabilitation center. Despite its condition, the gorilla kept its eyes open, watching the group as if it knew it was safe. Ethan whispered, "You're going to be okay. I promise we'll take care of you." The days that followed were challenging but also filled with hope. The gorilla received treatment and, surprisingly, began to recover faster than Ethan had imagined. It seemed stronger each day, and its glances at Ethan now carried a tranquility that hadn't been there before. It was as if it knew it had fulfilled its mission, and could finally rest. One day, while Ethan was checking the gorilla's bandages, he heard a familiar sound coming from the edge of the forest. It was the call of another gorilla. He froze for a moment, but then realized that the injured one had heard it too. The animal lifted its head, its eyes shining with immediate recognition. Ethan knew what that meant. Its family was waiting. Ethan and his team carried the gorilla to the clearing. It still limped but seemed immensely determined. In the distance, silhouettes began to emerge among the trees. They were other gorillas. The scene that followed was impossible to describe without feeling a lump in one's throat. The reunion was emotional, filled with sounds that seemed to carry years of stories, pain, and finally, relief. Ethan watched from a distance, tears in his eyes, as the gorilla joined the group. It looked back one last time, casting a glance at Ethan that said, "Everything words could never express." And then, it disappeared into the forest. Ethan stood there for a few minutes, absorbing the moment. He realized that this encounter had changed something within him. It wasn't just about saving animals or fighting poachers. It was about the connection between species, the ability to find courage amid fear, and the strength that exists in fighting for what truly matters. The story of Ethan and the gorilla is not just about a rescue. It serves as a powerful reminder that every life matters and that our actions, no matter how small they may seem, can have a profound impact. What that gorilla taught us was not only about courage, but also how empathy and compassion transcend any barrier. It showed us that, even amid pain, we can always fight for those we love. And now I want to hear from you. What did this story awaken in your heart? Have you ever witnessed something that made you believe in the power of connections? Leave your comment down below and share your experience. Let's spread these reflections and build a chain of love and care for our planet and all the lives that inhabit it. Oh, and if you were as moved by this story as I was, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we continue to bring stories that connect us to the world and make us reflect on how we can be better. Don't forget to activate the notification bell so you won't miss any new inspiring stories. Together, let's spread messages that inspire. Until the next video.